Great. Just a wide range of dialogues, which is what the Trump administration wants. We want to talk about the sticky things. We want to talk about the things people disagree or not sure on what direction. Perhaps my best event of Climate Week was yesterday in an Energizing Africa event. Of course, very different perspective from leaders in Africa, but we had an awesome, candid dialogue and some real actions coming there.
So you've said that climate change is real and it deserves attention. What do you mean by that, by attention?
Oh, I mean, it's a physical phenomenon. We should continue to monitor and study it. We've raised atmospheric CO2 levels by about 50%. It absorbs infrared radiation. It's contributing to warming. It's led to a little bit wetter world, a little bit greener world, a little bit warmer world, and likely will continue to do that. And so if it becomes a bigger deal, or it looks like it might become a bigger deal, there are pathways that could be pursued to change our energy system. But what's critical is the biggest issue in the world just by far today is 1 billion people live like us. We get to turn on light switches and travel on motorized transport and wear fancy clothes made with and out of hydrocarbons. 7 billion people want that. So by far the world's biggest challenge in the energy world is how do we get more energy? And if we can have more energy that's competitive with existing energy sources, that'll take off. But these attempts to impose expensive, unreliable energy that shrinks human possibilities, that's never going to go global. That's not, there's all this talk about an energy transition. The numbers just say it's not happening. It's hard.
So there are lots of people who you wouldn't consider activists who are saying that the U.S. does need renewables, especially for the AI boom and the electricity rising, demand rising for the first time in 2 decades. Just a few of them. You have the Dallas Fed. You have the Rand Corp. You have Next Era Energy CEO John Ketchum. All of them are saying that the U.S. does need renewables to get through, to feed the demand that AI is providing. I mean, are they just wrong?
Well, of course, renewables will still be developed. The big thing of the Trump administration is we're no longer going to take American taxpayer money to pay those businesses that have got subsidies for 30 plus years. That's enough. They should fly on their own now. But are they going to be very helpful in meeting the AI demands? I would say the data says no. Because when you design an electricity, like I often hear, we just need more electrons on the grid. That's how your gas tank works. That's not how the electricity grid works. You see cheap gas, you can pull over and top your tank off or keep it full. Electricity, we have to balance supply and demand at every second. So most of the time, the grid is sitting there today, it's got massive amount of spare capacity. It doesn't need extra electrons. When it needs, what matters is the capacity at peak demand. You have to be able to hit peak demand so that incubator in the hospital stays on and people don't freeze to death. So what matters is dependable capacity that's there at peak demand. Peak demand is usually a high-pressure system. In the wintertime, it's very cold air mass that sits stagnant, or in the summertime, a hot air mass that sits stagnant. The wind's not blowing in these high-pressure systems. In the wintertime, peak demand is always when it's dark out. So just adding more electrons on the grid doesn't grow the grid's capacity to power AI.
I want to press you on that because Next Era, one of the biggest utilities in the United States, says we need the renewables because if we just go all natural gas, there's a turbine backlog, and you have a shortage of natural gas workers.
Well, of course, there's a shortage of natural gas turbines right now because now we see growing demand for electricity. And if you're a data center, you got to have electricity that's 99.99% of the time on. That's not going to come from wind and solar. And if you've been collecting subsidies for 30 years, of course you'd like to collect them for a few more years. Solar will continue to be built. I mean, it is an energy source that in a number of applications plays a positive role. But in general, in the grid, no, they don't provide meaningful addition. California and Florida had not wildly different electricity grids 20 years ago. California's electricity price is 10 or 15% higher than Florida's. California said, we're going to fight climate change, and they were early movers in wind and solar and trying to do things differently. They closed down a lot of their reliable generating plants. Florida said, we're going to operate our grid as cheaply as we can. Much tougher to do in Florida. They're at the center of Hurricane Alley. in Florida. Today, Florida's electricity prices are 1/2 of California. California is twice as expensive as Florida is. Florida is a grid dominated by natural gas. It's got nuclear, it's got solar, it's got a little bit of everything, but 75% of its electricity comes from the cheapest source, natural gas. Much cheaper system cost, and Florida produces more electricity than California. If you want to open a business or build a data center, like, you can do that in Florida. You're not going to pay twice as much for the same product, electricity, in California.
You often say that it's time for wind and solar to get off subsidies. Oil and gas, they get subsidies. Now, you may have a different definition of subsidies, but does not oil and gas get tax breaks worth loads of money?
No, we don't. One of the things that's called a subsidy is when you drill a well, you get an ability to accelerate the depreciation, of that asset. And that's come and gone, but it's mostly been there. You get that in manufacturing and industries all across the country. So they call that a subsidy. Like, that's sort of silly. Now, of course, you get accelerated depreciation on everything. The way to look at this is look at the book income of companies and then look at the percent of that income they pay taxes on. You'll find the oil and gas industry one of the highest of any industry across the thing. I think banking and pharmaceuticals pay a higher percent of their actual book income in taxes. So no, I think it's entirely untrue to say oil and gas collect subsidies. I was in that industry for decades. I never saw any subsidies. The biggest oil and gas subsidies are overseas in low-income countries where governments subsidize the price of gasoline because it improves people's standard of living and voters like that. But in the United States, oil and gas is much more a net payer of taxes. It's a huge net payer of taxes.
Loads of economists have written papers that the U.S. oil and gas gets subsidies. So I guess they just have a different definition of what that is.
Yeah, there are no checks mailed to oil and gas companies to pay them to do things.
Tax breaks they get.
Tax break, it's not a tax break. It's just accelerated depreciation. It just means you pay the tax later in time. You don't pay less taxes.
What about nuclear? It gets subsidies, from U.S. subsidies, and it's been around since the 50s.
You're right. And in fact, in the One Big Beautiful Bill legislation, or the Working Americans Tax Cut Act, absolutely, I advocated to keep nuclear in there 8 more years to get the kind of subsidies wind and solar was getting. And the reason is the government smothered nuclear. It started in the 1950s. We started to build nuclear power plants. In 20 years, we had 100 built or under construction and permitted. Since then, in the last 30 or 40 years, we've brought on 2 reactors. We just crushed that industry with regulatory burden and a little bit of a fear campaign. So we need that industry as another source of energy. And so we're going to give temporary nudges to get it started. And it provides a product there's buyers for, 24/7 electricity. Whether the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, it's there. The other big thing about nuclear that we need, the distinguishing factor, is wind and solar and batteries. They're all in the electricity sector. Electricity is incredibly important, central to our lives. But electricity only delivers 20% of total global primary energy. It's the most expensive and highest form of energy, but the most important and largest use of energy is in manufacturing, high temperature process heat. In fact, to manufacture solar panels, incredibly energy intensive, very high temperature process heat to make polysilicon. Today, that only comes from burning hydrocarbons, only comes from combustion. Nuclear could move in and provide part of the process heat. It can play a meaningful role in the long-term energy system, not a bit player.
So on nuclear, your department is doing the approvals on 10 or 11 pilot nuclear plants. You want some of those to come on before July 4th next year. Is the DOE sort of slowly taking over the regulatory and the approvals for nuclear? Because there is the NRC, where President Trump fired one of the commissioners and is now only down to 3. And the executive order that Trump put out in May calls for nuclear approvals to come on 12 to 18 months from the NRC. Is there like a slow way that the Department of Energy is taking on more of the responsibilities?
No. We are working and helping. Of course, we have an all-of-government approach to try to make it easier and just less bureaucratic to develop energy. For nuclear, of course, safety, safety, safety. Those are the three most important things. That focus remains at the NRC. You're right, we have 2 new commissioners. We need to get seated on that. But I would say from the careers to the commissioners, people get, hey, we've had a regulatory regime. It just hasn't worked. China and Russia are building nuclear reactors in their own countries and around the world, and the U.S. is just out of this game. We shouldn't be out of the nuclear game. So common sense of forms. It's really just efficiency, too, just general business processes. How can we move things faster at the NRC so they can do rigorous safety evaluations, but not drag it on for years and years? Do it in a reasonable time frame. I'm quite bullish on that. For the DOE, the reactors we're doing, we have authorities on our own lands and in special circumstances to regulate to permit the building of plants. The thing we're doing by next year, those won't be selling electricity into the grid. These will be test running of nuclear reactors where they will go critical and all the critical systems will work and they'll generate the heat at the other side that would be used to generate electricity, just a faster testing demonstration of these reactors. In fact, that's going to be in partnership with the NRC. But NRC remains and will remain the primary regulator of nuclear generation.
And how do you envision the government will help nuclear? It needs a lot of help. There's been other cases yesterday. There's a story about how the government may take an equity stake in a lithium producer. Do you see the U.S., considering all these AI needs, the U.S. taking new measures like an equity stake in some kind of power company like a nuclear company?
We're looking at what can we do to accelerate the development of energy. It will dominantly be driven by businesses and markets, and that's what we want. At the DOE, we'll use our loan program office. If we have credit-worthy hyperscalers or other developers that are going to put billions of dollars of equity in, we are going to come behind and provide either loans or loan guarantees from commercial banks. And we'll do this for the first 10 or 20 reactors to get that ball rolling. Then we'll let the commercial capital markets work from there. But as a free market capitalist, I feel okay doing this with nuclear because the government smothered it. The government's got to get it going again. The supply chain got crushed as well. We need to get U.S.-based and American-owned enrichment going in the United States. We got to get fuel fabrication here. So we're providing nudges to get businesses moving again, stand up the supply chain.
I'm glad you mentioned the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office because in President Trump's first term, he only used that office for a loan to a nuclear company. Do you envision that the LPO is mostly going to be used for nuclear?
It'll be used for other things as well. And to go back to your lithium question, everyone sees right now that these rare earth elements and other critical materials that we become very dependent, not just for imports, but mostly imports from China. This just puts us in a sticky security situation. We want to reshore mining and manufacturing and particularly production and refining of critical minerals in our country again. That as well, when China got admitted to the World Trade Organization, so much of our industry just left our country, which means the jobs left, everything left with it. We want to bring back, not everything, but we want to bring back to the extent we can the industries that are critical for U.S. national security. And yes, the Loan Program Office beyond nuclear will certainly be helping those things, but not politically favored businesses, and we're not going to loan money because it sounds good. We have to do real business deals with serious businesses that have a business plan that the American taxpayers are going to get paid back.
And you mentioned uranium. The U.S. has a ban on uranium from Russia that runs out in 2027. India has complained that the U.S. is trying to stop India from buying exports of oil from Russia, but at the same time is buying imports, the U.S. is buying imports of uranium from Russia. How does that sit with you?
Yeah, and it's entirely true. So to enrich uranium, it isn't the mining of uranium that's the problem, but to enrich it is a large industrial process developed here in the United States. And then when the Cold War ended, Russia, as they dismantled their uranium from their weapons, has been very active in flooding the market with enriched uranium. And sadly, the enrichment capacity in the United States and around the world got depleted. so that everyone depends on Russian enriched uranium. Not for all of it, but for enough of it that it's bothersome. So there's a group, the Sapporo 5, Japan, the United States, Canada, France, and the United Kingdom are all working together to rapidly grow our enrichment capacity so that we can displace all Russian imported enriched uranium in the next 2.5 years. We have to move fast to do that. We wish we weren't sending money to Russia, but this is money measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The oil and gas imports of Europe are in the tens of billions of dollars, so 100 times larger. I wish we could cut off all the enriched uranium. Unfortunately, we can't. And for oil and gas, Europe can cut off all imports of oil and gas from Russia. We can supply all the gas that currently comes from Russia. We can supply the oil and refined products that go into Europe from Russia as well. That one's actually achievable now, and the dollars are much bigger.
So there's another way that Russia gets its uranium to the U.S., and that is through China. And the Energy Department launched a probe in that in the last administration. What are your concerns about that, and where's it going?
Oh, very concerned about that. So yeah, we've continued to figure out how can we trace the origin of this material, and no question about that. If you stop importing Russian stuff directly, they find other avenues. China is one of those avenues. So we continue to try to find and trace where that's coming from so that it can be cut off as well.
And how would that happen?
To import enriched uranium in the United States, you need a permit. You know, obviously these are materials. We will not issue permits for importing Russian uranium. In fact, you need a permit or an exception today to do it. We want someone to show there's no other way to run their power plants and supply it without this imported Russian uranium. You need a special exception to do that today. And as soon as we can stop granting those special exceptions, we will.
Now, you've kept, let's switch to coal for a second. You have kept a plant that was wanting to shut down in Michigan. You issued an order and said, no, for the security of the grid, you got to stay open. Are you going to use other powers to keep more coal plants open?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's not the only one. That's maybe the one that caught the most news. But yeah, the Campbell plant, 1.5 gigawatt plant in southwestern Michigan that politically from the governor, because it was in fashion, oh, we're going to close all our coal plants and here's the timeline. 15 years before the end of the life of the coal plant, they were going to close that coal power plant. So a little context setting. Coal is the largest source of electricity on the planet by far, and it has been for 125 years. Natural gas is second, but a distant second, 35% versus maybe mid-20% from natural gas. In the United States, that's reversed. It's over 40% of our electricity comes from gas, and coal is much less because it's outcompeted coal. But coal's still 16% of American electricity, and it provides electricity 24/7. No wind blowing, no sun shining, that coal plant's delivering electricity. So we stopped the closure of it. We got a lot of critiques or whatever. 2 days later, there was a brownout in MISO, the Midwest Independent System Operator. That would have been a blackout if we didn't have that 1.5 gigawatts of coal on.
So walk us through what powers you would use to keep other coal plants open.
So we have Section 202 authority that says for the security of our grid, we can do what we did there, which is force it to stay open only for 90 days. And then I have extended that one for another 90 days. But what we're doing now is starting dialogues with utilities across the country. And I will tell you, there's a large amount of them that are saying, thank God, we don't really have plans to supply this firm capacity. People want to bring data centers or manufacturing to us. Like if we close that plant, all the stuff that got permitted during the Biden administration is wind and solar. It's sometimes electricity. In utilities across the country are saying, thank you. Can we work together? How can we keep these coal plants open? We have these agreements that said they're going to be closed. We don't want to close them. We can't close them. So a lot of them will be cooperative with utilities. But that was sort of a statement that, number one, that was short time frame. We need to keep that plant open. And to let everyone know, energy sobriety has returned to Washington, D.C. Our focus is actually on Americans and the price of utility and avoiding blackouts and building businesses here. That's our focus.
So how many utilities are you talking to about possibly keeping them open?
Across the country. Lots.
My understanding is there's 38 coal plants that are slated to shut by the end of Trump's second term, of this term. What do you make of that number?
Well, I know the number. That sounds like that's probably about right. There was when Trump took office and I took my position here under the plans laid during the Biden administration, there was plans to close 100 gigawatts of firm generating capacity. So 38 coal plants, that's probably 60 gigawatts, something like that, depends the size of the plants. So there was plans to close 100 gigawatts, mostly coal, but also natural gas. And they had in the queue during that same 5-year period plans to build new 22 gigawatts of firm capacity, all of it natural gas, or a little bit, I don't even know if nuclear was even in there, maybe a little bit of hydro. But in any case, close 100, build 22, a reduction of 78 gigawatts of firm generating capacity to lead China in AI and start to reindustrialize America. We think we need 100 gigawatts more of firm capacity in the next 5 years. So if we got to get up plus 100, we certainly don't want to dig a hole of minus 78.
So how many gigawatts of coal do you want to stop from saving?
All of it that's viable. Some of these coal plants are small and old and truly uneconomic, not just because of burdensome regulations or mandates. Those will close. I would say the majority of that coal capacity will stay online.
But no new coal plants, right?
Well, that's up to businesses. But today, if you look at the economics, natural gas is pretty compelling versus coal. It's cheaper to build in capital costs. It's cheaper to operate. It's more flexible. So, if somebody wanted to build a coal plant, they had an economic case for it, absolutely, we would work with them to do that. But I think it's unlikely to see much of that. We may see a little of that. I don't know.
What about plants that want to retire that are run on oil or on natural gas? There's already been an example of the natural gas.
Yeah, we kept open a plant outside of Philadelphia that was over 100 years old. So that sounds kind of crazy. We're keeping old 100 years old plant. It ran on oil because it was a peaker plant. And we again, used 202 authority to keep it open. We got a thank you about 15 days later. That plant ran at near peak capacity. You've got to be ready to meet peak demand. Just having a blackout or forcing things to shut down. I don't want my kid in the incubator at the hospital and they, well, sorry, we closed that plant. We didn't like it anymore. So yes, we're doing everything we can in consultation with people there to how can we stop the huge rise in electricity prices we've seen over the last 4 years? There's still momentum of that. Everything that's coming online now was approved in the last 4 years. So what's coming online is more of this intermittent generating electricity capacity. We've got to speed up as much as we can new firm capacity, and we've got to stop existing firm capacity from retiring.
You were over at the UN yesterday, and you've called UN climate talks, which are set to take place in November in Brazil. You've called that whole process silly. But President Xi Jinping of China came in a message to the assembly yesterday and said he didn't reference the U.S., but he said some countries are backtracking on the energy transition, and he said that everyone should maintain unwavering action on efforts to work to curb climate change and transition. Are you at all worried that China is taking the lead on renewables and is going to dominate this industry? An industry like, for instance, solar that was invented in the U.S.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. U.S. technology. So first context, and then I'll go back to the China comment. The world has spent about $5 trillion in the last 20 years on wind, solar, batteries, and grid that enable the connection of wind and solar to our grid. $5 trillion. It provided last year, 2024, 2.6% of total global energy, all the way up to 3.0% in the United States. Very tiny amount of energy for trillions of dollars. And to come back to the China comment, what's been the demand for energy has grown much faster than that. It hasn't even been it's only been a small slice of the incremental demand for energy. It hasn't displaced any existing demand for energy. But here's been the impact of that, the early movers, Denmark, Germany, United Kingdom. What's been the result of that? Germany spent $500 billion themselves in their own country for their Energiewende, their energy revolution. They went from 79% of their energy from hydrocarbons in the German economy, 79% to somewhere between 74 and 75%. 4 or 5 points of reduction. Like that would be centuries more for even Germany to get to zero. They tripled their price of electricity while doubling the capacity of their electricity and producing 20% less electricity. $500 billion, 20% less electricity at triple the cost. So what was the result of that? German voters are angry, German people are angry, and industry has left Germany. You can't afford to make energy-intensive stuff. Germany was an industrial powerhouse. And where did all that stuff go? To China. China's been a huge winner. When the United Kingdom shuts down their steel industry and their plastic industry and their auto industry, where does that industry go? A tiny bit of it goes to the U.S. The majority of it goes to China. So that this sort of rush to net zero, it's been a home run for China. It's been horrible for people in wealthy nations that have seen their electricity prices rise and their jobs go overseas. If you're in Africa, or at that African forum we was at yesterday, infuriating. They thought colonialism was dead. They tried to build a coal power plant in Mombasa in Kenya, a country that desperately needs more electricity. No one would touch it with a 10-foot pole or fund it. So to me, we've been immoral to people in low-income nations. We've been immoral to people that are low income in our own countries. But the huge winner has been China. We've shipped our energy-intensive industry to China because guess what? China says whatever it wants. China built 100 coal plants last year and has 100 under construction right now. 100 gigawatts of coal plants under construction, brought on last year, 100 more under construction right now. So it doesn't matter what China says about climate policy. They're growing their electricity, they're building their industrial might, and they're saying, please keep sending us your industry. The race to net zero brings us industry. Please keep sending it.
You studied solar in university, but we're about the same age. I mean, solar is much different now. It's approaching 40% efficient. Are you not afraid that the U.S. is just giving it away to China, letting them lead? And I mean, we're talking about the future. I mean, these things develop.
But you're right. But see where you were, though, 40% efficient. Like, how much room for improvement is there? 2.5 times. 100% efficient is pretty hard. We'll get higher. So there's upside in solar, but not a ton, actually. Not a ton. Costs have come down, but costs have come down for the panels. They're a tiny part of the cost of solar. The main cost of solar is land, grid connection, and the biggest cost by far is how do you deliver electricity when the sun goes behind a cloud or most every night when it sets. That's the cost of solar because you have a grid running and the sun comes out, a natural gas power plant has to produce a little less electricity because you've got to balance at all times because the solar electricity can get on the grid. When you don't burn that little bit of natural gas, that saves you 2 cents for that kilowatt hour that's not generated, but it costs you about 10 cents and 4 cents of government subsidies to replace that kilowatt hour.
We've got about, this will be the last
But I'm
question.
bullish on the technology. We are working on our national labs. New solar materials, solar to power things in space, solar for energy in remote locations in Alaska to Africa and all that. Solar has a future. I'm enthusiastic about that future. We're supporting research on the future of solar energy. So yes, it's going to go around. It's going to be here. It's never going to power the world in large scale. But from its 1.2% today, it probably gets several times bigger than that. And I'm cheering for it, just without subsidies.
I have loads more questions, but we only have time for one more. This week you've said it's not impossible that you'll go to the UN climate talks in Brazil. What would make it possible?
Well, schedule's tight, but if we had an agreement in the administration that, hey, it makes sense to go down and kind of bring a human-focused message to the climate community, and there were open ears there to explain why the U.S.'s position is different. Look, 3 things have come out of net zero 2050. More expensive energy, deindustrialization, and reduced progress in energy access growth. 2 billion Africans are cooking their daily meals and heating their homes, burning wood. 2 million easily preventable deaths every year from indoor air pollution. These are the giant problems in the world. When COP in Glasgow, 19 wealthy nations vowed not to provide any capital for hydrocarbon development in the developing world. That to me was such a moral outrage. 2 million needless deaths a year, and we're not going to help prevent those deaths and liberate those women to have time to live their lives and education. We're going to make them spend hours a day gathering wood and then over a smoky stove because that makes us feel good at the cocktail parties in New York City. That's frankly offensive to me. So if that's what the COPs are about, I would be embarrassed for the United States to be associated with that. But might I go down to deliver a message like that? I'll tell you more than half the nations there will say, you know, he's totally right. And they know that already. They don't need to hear it from me. But hey, we're here because we're told, we keep being told there's going to be trillions of dollars of climate aid, which to them is just aid dollars, coming to our countries. So we got to play along with this charade. But I'll tell you, inside, they are seething with anger at this neo-colonial, paternalistic attitude to people trying to get more energy.
And if you don't go, will the administration have a presence at all?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Secretary Wright, thanks very much for joining us.
Wish we could talk longer, but appreciate the dialogue, and I think we'll continue to talk.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.